Hi folks, and welcome back to part 5 of my UK chili pepper growing guide series. This today is probably the most important day in the growing calendar for me because I'm going to be getting a lot of my peppers into their final pots. Today we've got a kind of two-part video. The first is going to be getting your chili peppers outside. When is the right time? What temperatures do you need to look out for? What other things do you need to watch out for? Because there's a few things that I've done wrong that I can show you. And part 2 is going to be the actual potting up process. For me, this always feels like a major event in the garden calendar and I absolutely love it. So when should you be thinking about bringing your chili plants outside? I guess the first question and the first thing that you need to think about is what your final growing position is. Are they just going out into your back garden? Do you have something undercover, a greenhouse, a polytunnel? That changes things quite dramatically. You can take these outside and just grow them somewhere. If you've got like a nice south-facing sun trap, these can grow really well just outdoors. You don't have to have a greenhouse or a polytunnel for them. But generally speaking, if you're going to be putting them out undercover into a greenhouse or a polytunnel, you can bring them out a little bit earlier, but you do need to be aware of something that a lot of beginners fall into. A lot of beginners think that overnight your polytunnel and your greenhouse are going to be really warm, when in fact they're going to cool down extremely quickly. There's not going to be that much difference between what's outside and the temperature inside in your greenhouse, so waiting until it's properly warmed up is absolutely key. The temperature that you want to be looking for is a nighttime temperature of 10 degrees or above. Generally, in the daytime, if you're starting to move towards shorts and everyone around is wearing shorts, then it's probably going to be okay, but you do need to look at those nighttime temperatures. And looking at the forecast is one thing, but gathering your own data is absolutely invaluable. There can be a really big difference between your own localized outdoor growing conditions and what is forecast on kind of weather modeling and your local weather station, which might be a good few miles away. And so investing in a little thermometer where you can keep track of the trends, see what the nights are dipping to, compare that to the forecast, really invaluable. I've had this little Govee thermometer out in the polytunnel and I've got one in the greenhouse as well, and I know that generally the lowest we've seen recently since I brought these peppers out has been 9 degrees. Ideally you want 10 to kind of 15 for a nighttime temperature for them to be really comfortable, but above 10 you're generally going to be okay. Another trap that beginners can fall into is thinking that this 10-degree guide is just a guide and that it doesn't really matter that much. You know, everyone knows chili peppers like heat, but they need it, and it's really good advice to hold off and keep them indoors for as long as you can. And I've got a perfect example for you. This is a Sugar Rush Long Peach that was brought out to the greenhouse a little bit too early. I did this deliberately to show you the difference. Both of these are in 1 litre pots, and can you guess which one was left indoors? Both of these are pot bound. They're not the healthiest of plants, but you can see the difference and what happens if you bring a plant outside too soon before the temperatures have warmed up. Basically, your plants will be okay. So if it's kind of do or die, if you don't have any other choice but to get them out, they will survive under 10 degrees, but they won't grow. They will kind of stall like this one has. There's a little bit of growth coming out the bottom, and that's probably just since it started to warm up. But for the longest time, this has just sat doing virtually nothing, just kind of hanging on, surviving but not thriving. Meanwhile, this one, which has been kept at home, far from ideal. You can see it's far too kind of tall, it's getting a bit long, it's not got much growth. It has started coming out, now it's got the sunshine, but it's going to be so much further ahead than the one that was brought out into the greenhouse too early. So definitely do not underestimate the power of those cold nights to completely stall your plants. The other thing which I have personally underestimated is the power of the sun and the ability for it to completely destroy your plants. I have never had sun scorch as bad as this year, and I did not harden off enough. I was a bit cavalier, a bit kind of like, I'm sure it will be fine. I think for about 3 days I was putting these outside just in the back garden to get a little taste of the proper full sunshine, which is very different from a grow light. This is especially harmful to the plants which have just been under the tiny little blurple, kind of much less powerful grow lights. The one that have been under a super super duper light, they have also had quite a lot of sunburn actually, and a bit of sun scorch, but nowhere near as bad as this. So ideally you want to set aside at least a week to be bringing these out, you know, half an hour at first for the first day, just give them their first little taste of sun, then back in an hour the next. If it's full sun, then be really careful. If you've got a full cloudy overcast day, then you can put them out for a little bit longer. But it is a really good idea to give them a week or two of an adjustment period. If possible, best case scenario, you could bring them out to their final growing position. I can't really do that, and a lot of my viewers who have allotments won't be able to do that because it's a whole trek. You've got to get the car out and load your boot up with your chilies. Maybe if you've only got one or two, you could put them into the greenhouse, but it's good to acclimatize them into that final growing position, and then at night time bring them back into your warm and cozy house where it's definitely going to be above 10 degrees. If you do get a bit of sun scorch, don't worry, you should still have a really nice healthy root system if you've had a good strong growth and a good strong start to your year. So a lot of these leaves will start to die back. If it's really bad like this one, I should probably take this off so the plant can continue to grow. I've left it on for demonstration purposes, but so long as you've got a nice healthy plant and nice healthy roots, the plant will shoot forth with loads more fresh healthy growth, which will be much better adapted for the power of the sun. Now let's talk about the next stage, potting up. But first I do want to say, just because it's time for me to do a lot of my final pot sizes, that doesn't mean it's right for you. It does depend on a lot of different situations. I did a whole episode and a whole segment on the correct pot sizes, so that is linked below. But a quick recap, I have a massive range of pot sizes. I've been doing a lot of planning today. As you can see, a lot of these plants, they're just in little pots for now, but I've put them inside the pot that they will be going into today. And I've got a whole range, like I say, between 2.5 litres, we've got the 10 litre here, I've got 6.5s, I've got 5s, I've got 12 litres, and I've got 10 litres as well. So it all depends on a lot of different factors. I mentioned that it might not be right for you to pot up just yet. Generally, when you pot up, your plant is going to be comfortable for another 4 to 6 weeks. This one was last potted on the end of February the 27th. So it's been in this tiny little pot for 9 weeks now. These are absolutely crying to be potted on, but I didn't have the space indoors. This is a very common problem that you'll run into if you're growing chili peppers. So this, for me, I want it to be a really good plant, a really large plant. This is a Sugar Rush Long Peach. I want as much fruit off this as possible. So it's going to be going into a 10 litre pot today. In the pot size video, I said ideally you want to be going to no more than around 5 times the size of your current pot. So if you're in a 1 litre pot, you would normally go up to around 5 litres. But I'm really confident about the temperatures now, and I know a lot of these healthy plants, I'm putting the biggest, healthiest plants into the 10 litre pots, and I know they're going to romp away. If I had something like this slightly sickly, sunburnt plant that I was showing you earlier, I would not be putting this straight into a 10 litre pot because it's going to be growing much slower, and those roots aren't going to fill the pot. You're probably going to end up with a waterlogged compost at the bottom of your soil, and it's a situation you want to avoid. So for something like this, I would go up to the intermediate stage. This is a 2.5 litre pot. I'm going to be doing a lot of these slower growing ones that were brought up into the greenhouse a little bit too early. I'm going to be doing those into 2.5 litres. So the ideal pot size for your plant will completely depend on the purpose of that chili. If you want maximum growth, go for the biggest pot size possible if you've had good strong growth and they've been potted up for around 4 to kind of 7 weeks. You can kind of get away with a little bit of that grey area. Let me pick up the camera and walk you around and show you a few of the decisions I've been making, because I think it'll be really helpful for you to see. One other really key consideration when thinking about pot size is the variety of plant that you're growing as well. So generally speaking, the pot size will dictate the size of the pepper pod. So if you're growing, for example, something like a jalapeno, or let's say a bell pepper, because I couldn't find my jalapeno, what you will really want to do is make sure that they're in the biggest pot possible. Because if you're in something like a 5 litre pot for a bell pepper or a jalapeno, they're gonna have small pods. And obviously that's fine, you can still use the pods, but for something like a jalapeno, normally you want to have it raw. You might want to have it sliced on a pizza or make a jalapeno popper or something like that. The same is true with this California Wonder bell pepper. It's a bit like a small onion. You don't really want a small onion just because you lose the economies of scale in the kitchen. It's a lot more faff to chop up and to prepare. So for some varieties of pepper and chili, you do want to keep that in mind and try and aim for the bigger pot size. If you've got something that you're growing maybe for the first time that you've not tried before, like I've got over here with my Kangstar Sweet Queenie, I mean, this is a double whammy. This is a pepper I've never grown before, so I'm interested just to try a few of the pods. And it's also grown very, very poorly. You can see it's very, very small. This was just under the blue light. It's had a bit of sun scorch. It's not looking great, although fantastically compact. So this one, I'm just putting in a 2.5 litre. And if I left it in this, I'd probably still get some decent sized peppers that would allow me to get a sense of the flavour profile and how it grows, and if I want to grow it next year, and if I want to do it a bit bigger. The Chinense varieties are really one to watch out for. So these are your hotter peppers, something like a Scotch bonnet, a red habanero. I've got one of those in here somewhere. You can see the difference in the growth structure. I love these plants. They're so beautiful. Big, broad leaves. You've got one up here as well, compared to the slightly more slender leaves of a different chili variety. And generally speaking, you want to be a bit more careful with these because they're a slow growing plant. So most of these are in 5 litre pots at the moment. And I think because they've grown quite well, but they are slightly on the slow side, I'm going to put them into 5, and if they really romp away, if they start getting really good growth, then there's still time to plant them up to maybe a 7.5 or a 10 litre pot later in the year. And the other thing to think about, this really applies if you're doing it at scale like me. If you're growing more than 10 plants, have a proper plan. You don't need to have a written plan ahead of time, but today I have spent many hours like looking around the greenhouses, looking around my polytunnel, looking around my grow space. So I've got the 2 greenhouses back here and over here as well. I've got a nice 10 foot by 20 foot polytunnel with a fair bit of room for growing chili peppers. So I've done an awful lot of thinking about which varieties are going to go where before I've decided the pot size, because the bigger the pot size, the bigger the plant and the more room they need, obviously. The last thing you want to do is plant everything up, do all the work of potting these on into gigantic 10 litre pots and then going, oh, wait a second, I've only got room for 5 or 6 of those in my greenhouse. Where am I going to put them all? It's much better to cull off the plants at this stage, save yourself the time, the effort, give them away to neighbours while they can still be potted up and put into their greenhouse. There's a very good chance, if you're like me, you've got slightly more plants than you should have and you're struggling to fit them in. I've got some good room in here, just a little space up here on the greenhouse, and here is another good example of the pot sizes. So this is another new variety for me this year, a pubescens. Looks fascinating, very, very cool plant, but one I just want to try. So I've got 2 of those in little 2.5 litres. These are the slightly bigger ones. These are 7.5, which is kind of the smallest I would recommend for a sweet or a mild pepper. You want those to get nice and big. So this is a beaver dam, and we've got a pepper tube back there. And then elsewhere in this greenhouse, I've got a little self-watering system, a quad grow back here, and space for just a few. What you don't want to do, and trust me, I'm speaking from experience, you don't want to cram too many plants into too small a space for a few reasons. First is light. The plants will be competing with each other for light. The second is maintenance. When the plants start growing into one another, it becomes an absolute pain to try and harvest them or do anything like that with them. And the third is watering. If you're doing manual watering, once again, it becomes a jungle. Speaking from experience, and you end up neglecting your plants a little bit, or you're more likely to miss things that have been unwatered or something like that. You might miss a problem or a pest problem. You might miss ripe chilies. It's just, honestly, it's so much better to just plant for the space that you have. And a really good way to do that actually is using saucers. Here are all my pot sizes, the 2.5s, the 5s, the 7.5s and the 10s, the main ones I like to use. But for all of them, I like to use these saucers. And at this stage in the growing season, these are perfect for going around and setting out the spacing too. So let's pop into the polytunnel where I'm just starting to get things ready. And in here we've got this auto-pop watering system. This was absolutely phenomenal last year. I just need to make a little bit more space for the plants here. We've got this mini self-watering system, uses a wicking mat called a Chili Grow. And I've set out, they've been knocked about a bit, but basically 2 lots of 6 plants. And the idea is that I will be able to get into here to water It's all going to be pushed over a little bit, and I need to have a little clear up in the polytunnel and that kind of thing. But earlier in the day, I had all of the plants in there, imagining them getting to full size, kind of trying to work around them. And I think, to be honest, I'm still going to have a few too many plants, but I do every year. It's sort of part of the fun, but do as I say, not as I do. Don't grow too many plants, or you can grow as many as you want, but don't try and cram them into too small a space where they're going to be fighting with each other. It becomes a headache. I do have another pot size example as well. These 2.5 litres. I've got 3 plants which I'm putting into the ground directly in the polytunnel this year, which is something I've not done before. But I think it's probably a good idea to just wait a little bit longer, and instead of planting them straight into the ground right now in their 1 litre pots, just give them a little bit more of a boost. Give them a little 2.5 litre pot, which will just give the soil in the polytunnel that little bit longer to warm up. It's probably a good idea if you're doing anything that is going to be going into a raised bed or going into the ground. Just give it a little bit longer. Don't plant it out when the nights are 10 degrees. Wait until you've had that for a good few weeks, as well as warm days, so that the soil can really warm up, and so the roots of these chili plants aren't going to get a nasty shock. The sources are, of course, as well brilliant for bottom watering. You can just pour the water straight in here and let the plants absorb it. I've talked all throughout the series about the importance of bottom watering and how it can really help the root development of your chili pepper plants. In terms of the actual process of potting these up, it's exactly the same as earlier in the season. It's just scaled up. So for me, I use a very interesting tool, which is actually this old bathtub, which I found on an allotment. It is perfect for mixing up the amount of compost that you need when you're going into full kind of 10 litre chili pepper plant pots. But yes, in terms of the potting mix, I still use the one from Chili Chump. Linked in the description, his potting mix. It's absolutely phenomenal. I just do it at much bigger scale. Empty out whole bags of compost, 40 litres at a time, into that big bathtub, mix it all up, and then get these potted on and put into their final growing position. And if you can, putting in a plant support while you're potting this up is probably the best timing. I have a history of forgetting to do this. Obviously this is an old one that I used last year. And there's a few ways you can do it. If you're in a really big pot, you can just do one kind of bamboo cane that you then tie the main stem into. But because I use a lot of the smaller pots, one cane will just end up getting really loose because there's not that much compost to hold it in place. So I like to get 3 and basically set them in a triangle around your plant with twine that goes through, and then that twine can support the branching stems that come out and keep everything nice and supported. If you don't do this and you have a really good growing year, you run the risk of a plant getting a really heavy branch which falls and actually snaps under its own weight. So getting the support in nice and early now is a really good idea, because you're less likely to damage the plants, and if you're putting canes into the compost, you're not going to be damaging their roots because they won't have filled out the pot just yet. I really hope your growing season is going very well and you found this super useful. Thank you ever so much for watching. An extra special thank you to all of my Chili Pepper tier patrons: Tony, Bill, Pam, Louise, Mel, Michael, Denise, Socks in the Garden, Andrew, Sarah, Dorcasaur, Angela and Louise. Hopefully I'll see you again in the next one when all of these will be romping away.